His name is known all around the world. For some, that name is notorious, as many associate Benjamin Netanyahu with the brutal ongoing war between Israel and Hamas, and the extreme destruction that's left in the wake of the months of bombing campaigns carried out by his government. For others, especially domestically, Netanyahu is a figure protecting the interests of his people, a man whose own family story is one of loss and devotion to Israel's right to exist. A politically savvy statesman who has managed to secure a record 6 terms as the head of his country's government. So, who is Benjamin Netanyahu, and what is the story of Israel both under his leadership, before, and in the future? Benjamin Netanyahu was born in 1949, 1 year after the State of Israel officially came into being. Although born in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu spent a part of his childhood in the city of Philadelphia in the United States, where his father was a professor of history at Cornell University. Benjamin's father, Benjamin Netanyahu, was a noted academic, historian, and scholar of the revisionist Zionist tradition of Judaism. Benjamin was born in Poland, himself the son of a famous rabbi and Zionist activist called Nathan Milikowski, and he migrated at the age of 10 to mandatory Palestine. Early in life, Benjamin changed the family name from the Slavic-sounding Milikowski to the more Hebrew-sounding Netanyahu, meaning God has given, a practice common among Jewish arrivals to the region at that time. Benjamin later became a passionate advocate for the recognition by the US of a Jewish state in the Middle East as he assumed academic positions in the US. The elder Netanyahu believed very strongly in the need for a strict separation between the Jewish and Arab populations of Palestine, including by way of an iron wall separating the two communities. This was a worldview which lent itself to a rather hawkish strand of Zionism when the State of Israel was later established in 1948. A professor of both the Hebrew language and medieval history, Benjamin moved his family to the US in 1963, and it would be here that a young Benjamin would spend part of his formative years, going on to retain a characteristic Philadelphia accent throughout his life despite returning to Israel with the outset of the Six-Day War in 1967. Netanyahu joined the Sayeret Matkal, a special reconnaissance unit of the Israel Defense Force, and served with distinction for 5 years, seeing combat in both the Six-Day War and the subsequent war of attrition between Israel and its neighbors. He later briefly rejoined the military, once again following the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Following his military service, Netanyahu returned to the United States, receiving a bachelor's degree in architecture from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and later a master's degree in business from the MIT Sloan School of Management, where he graduated top of his class. He also began a doctorate in political science, but this was soon disrupted by a great personal bereavement stemming from an event which took place far away from either Israel or the United States. In 1976, during which time Netanyahu had completed his service in the military and the Israel Defense Forces and returned to live and work in the US, a major hostage crisis unfolded at an airfield in the southern African country of Uganda. On the 27th of June, a militant left-wing organization from West Germany known as the Revolutionary Cells, together with a Palestinian militant organization known as Black September, hijacked Air France Flight 139 en route from Tel Aviv to Paris, having boarded as the flight made a stopover in Athens. The hijackers took over 200 passengers as hostages to Entebbe Airport in Uganda, where they had been offered safe haven by Ugandan dictator Idi Amin. The event captured world attention, and the Israeli government felt under intense pressure to act swiftly and decisively, recalling the notorious Munich massacre of 4 years earlier when a hostage crisis carried out by the same Palestinian militant organization at the Summer Olympics in Munich had ended with the deaths of 5 Israeli athletes and 6 coaches. It was decided to conduct a daring mission to rescue the captives involving the Sayeret Matkal, acting on intel provided by the Mossad. Operation Entebbe was a success, with 102 of the 106 captive Israeli or Jewish hostages being freed as the unit stormed the airport terminal. But the mission did result in 1 fatality amongst the Israeli special forces. The commanding officer of the raid responsible, 30-year-old Deputy General Yonatan Netanyahu. As the name would suggest, Yonatan, or Yoni Netanyahu, was the brother of Benjamin and the oldest of Benjamin's 3 sons. Like his brother, Yonatan had grown up in the US and attended Harvard University in the mid-1960s before also abandoning his studies following the outbreak of the Six-Day War. Yonatan was a much-beloved figure in the IDF, remaining in the army and being decorated for his involvement in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, during which he took charge of a unit in the Golan Heights offensive. This, in turn, led to Yonatan being placed in command of the unit which would be tasked with executing Operation Entebbe. Despite its successful result, Yonatan was shot and killed under contested circumstances as the Israeli commandos stormed the airport terminal. He became seen as a martyr and a hero in Israel, and the mission was later renamed Operation Yonatan in his honor. The death of its eldest son had a profound effect on the Netanyahu family, and Benzion moved back to Israel shortly after. The events of the 1970s also resonated profoundly with Israeli society, and the year after Yonatan's death saw the right-wing Likud enter government for the first time, dethroning the Social Democratic Labour Party in a landslide electoral victory. The Labour Party had dominated Israeli politics for the 30 years of its existence until that point, but had received blistering criticism for the under-preparation of Israel's military against the Arab coalition surprise attack in 1973. The effect that his brother's death had on Netanyahu and the decisions which would later dictate his leadership of Israel are debated, but generally seen as quite influential, himself later declaring that the events marked the birth of his political life. Following the death of Yonatan, Netanyahu pursued a professional career as an economic consultant in Boston for some time, where he could be seen strenuously defending Israel and its right to exist in various public debates. He'd often be sparring with Palestinian and leftist speakers under his assumed name of Ben Netanyahu. Not long after the Entebbe operation, Netanyahu also founded the Yonatan Institute, named after his brother, an organization devoted to the study of terror and counter-terror, which Benjamin led from 1978 to 1980. In 1988, Benjamin Netanyahu entered politics back in Israel as a member of the right-wing Likud, or Consolidation Party. During this period, renewed violence in Israel and the West Bank had broken out with what was known as the First Intifada, or uprising, which started in 1987. The Intifada occurred in response to an increase in Israeli settlement building in the West Bank, as well as mounting restrictions on Arab freedoms in Israel following a war with Lebanon earlier in the decade, as well as a host of other grievances. The period saw massive protests and civil disobedience by the Palestinians against Israel, continuing for over 5 years. It also featured bloody attacks by Palestinian militant groups, which were followed by severe suppression by state security forces. The uprising saw the first actions of a newly established Islamist organization known as Hamas, which emerged when the violence erupted in 1987 and which began to carry out waves of suicide bombings against Israeli targets. Still, the First Intifada did see some glimpses of hope for dialogue and peace. In 1988, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, accepted US proposed conditions for peace talks: rejection of terrorism, recognition of Israel's right to exist, and acceptance of a UN Security Council resolution calling upon Arab states to accept Israel's right to, quote, live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries. The 1990s further offered a hopeful guise with the signing of the Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO in 1993, bringing to an end the First Intifada. As a side note, the same year also saw major political success for Netanyahu as he rose to the leadership of the Likud party for the first time. Now, not long after, the Palestinians' longtime ally, Jordan, took a major step by becoming only the second Arab state after Egypt to recognize Israel's borders, a significant boost to chances for peace in the region. But these hopes for peace were quickly dashed not long after. In 1994, Israeli extremist Barak Goldstein, a member of the right-wing extremist Kach movement, carried out what became known as the Cave of the Patriarchs massacre when he attacked the Ibrahimi Mosque in the Palestinian city of Hebron and murdered 29 worshippers. Almost immediately afterwards, Hamas carried out several suicide attacks, in turn killing dozens of Israeli civilians. And in 1995, Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was shot and killed by Yigal Amir, an ultra-Orthodox extremist vehemently opposed to the signing of the Oslo Accords in an event which further inflamed the atmosphere of instability in the country. After a brief term interim by Rabin's deputy, Shimon Peres, Netanyahu won a snap election and was elected Prime Minister of Israel for the first time, becoming, at the age of 46, the youngest Prime Minister to date, as well as the first ever to have been born in the independent state of Israel. Netanyahu's first term as Prime Minister did not see the situation with Israel's neighbors improve. Taking office in 1996, Netanyahu failed to mend relations with nearby Syria, which have remained terrible ever since. And although he committed to withdrawing Israeli forces from Hebron in 1997, this caused massive upset within hardline elements of the Israeli political spectrum, whose pressure would become an important feature of Netanyahu's domestic and foreign policies in the years to come. Not insignificant among his critics was his own father, Benzion, by now in his late 80s, but still influential in Zionist discourse, who publicly opposed the government's plans to share Hebron with the Palestinians. With criticism abounding, Netanyahu failed to be re-elected as prime minister in 1999, losing that year's election by a significant margin to his long-term rival and party colleague, Ariel Sharon, and also lost leadership of the Likud to Sharon that same year. The end of Netanyahu's first term and the beginning of the Sharon era also marked the first time that the Likud party led a majority government in Israel. In some ways, this in itself would mark the start of a more conservative shift, which would continue through the 2000s and which represented a stark departure from the Israeli leadership of much of the 20th century, which had, as recently as the 1980s, been led by the Labour Party. What was clear was the period marked a toughening of minds in Israel towards the peace process. Something perhaps none better encapsulated than by Netanyahu himself, whose policies with regard to the Palestinian question would only harden in the years thereafter. At the turn of the century, a new sequence of events would take place, which would further change the political landscape in Israel and lay the grounds for Netanyahu's return to leadership. After the end of his term as prime minister in 1999, Netanyahu continued to occupy important roles in the Israeli government, such as foreign minister between 2002 and 2003 and finance minister for 2 years after that. But that period also saw a new and intense era of conflict, with the eruption of what became known as the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada began in September of that year, when Netanyahu's successor, Ariel Sharon, paid a visit to the Temple Mount complex in Jerusalem. The complex, which also features the Al-Aqsa Mosque compounds and is revered by Jews and Muslims alike, had been banned from entry by Jews since it came into the State of Israel's hands in 1967. The visit occurred at a contentious time, with recent peace talks between Israeli and Palestinian leadership having failed and come to nothing. Moreover, it happened only 10 days after Palestinians commemorated the 1982 Sabra and Shatila massacre, an event in which Lebanese armed forces, with the backing of the Israeli military, had killed thousands of Shia Muslims and Palestinian refugees against the backdrop of the Lebanese civil war. The defense minister responsible for the Israeli army's presence in Lebanon at that time just happened to have been Sharon, and for many, he himself was liable for the massacre. The outrage among worshippers at Sharon's visit to the site spilled into the second uprising, which continued for 5 years and resulted in many more dead than the first. With rioting breaking out across the West Bank, Israeli forces put down violence with reckless abandon, killing hundreds of Palestinians. The Second Intifada was punctuated by intense violence and a massive suicide bombing campaign by Hamas. All in all, it resulted in more than twice as many total deaths as the First Intifada. The Israeli death toll, however, was almost 5 times higher than it had been in the first, though this was still significantly less than the number of killed Palestinians. Among the violence, several instances stood out which displayed the particularly gruesome nature of this conflict. In October 2000, 2 off-duty IDF reservists blundered into the Palestinian town of Ramallah, where they were arrested and brought to a local police station. As word of their presence spread, an incensed mob of locals assembled and dragged the captives from the station, going on to both lynch and mutilate their bodies. The event was captured by a nearby Italian news team, and images of the killings shocked the world, with one image of a Palestinian man raising his blood-stained hands in celebration, resonating particularly strongly with global audiences and with the Israeli public. The Second Intifada shook Israeli public opinion once more. Although it was eventually also suppressed by Israel, this was not before thousands of Israelis and Palestinians had died, most of them civilians, and not before 2 significant steps were taken, one which would lead to massive criticism of the Israeli government externally, and one which would lead to comparable criticism internally. The first was the completion of the West Bank Barrier, a monumental physical frontier separating the West Bank and Israel along the so-called Green Line, the armistice line reached between Jordan and Israel following the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. While the building of the barrier had begun during the early 1990s, it was completed only as the Second Intifada came to a close. Although the barrier did succeed in reducing the number of attacks by Palestinian militants against the Israeli population, it stood as a poignant symbol of the strict separation of communities stemming from the conflict and massively prohibited the free movement of Palestinians, including from carrying out their day-to-day jobs in Israel. Some have also criticized the barrier as a quiet land grab. Portions of the wall do not run directly along the so-called Green Line and instead cut deep into the West Bank, swallowing up around 10% of its territory and cutting through land which had previously belonged to Palestinian farmers. Perhaps not lost on some was Benjamin Netanyahu's allusion to the need for an iron wall between the communities, something he'd advocated for since the very founding of the State of Israel. The second development, which would receive far more criticism from the Israeli public, was the government's 2005 decision to completely withdraw all Jewish settlers from the Gaza Strip and to close all Jewish settlements which had been built there. Some religious settlers refused to leave, and scenes of observant Jews with long beards and in religious garb being physically pulled from their homes were simply too much to stomach for the conservatives in Israeli political circles. This was a perceived treason, which they would neither forgive nor forget. And it was at this time that the Likud party came to dominate Israeli politics once again, with a poll amongst its supporters showing a majority rejected the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. The Likud support stemmed largely from the religious ultra-Orthodox community, as well as the Yemenite and Mizrahi Jewish populations of Israel who'd previously resided across the Arab world and who'd mostly fled to Israel after 1948 and following the Six-Day War. As their numbers increased, it began to dramatically alter the demographic structure of the state and likewise its voting currents. Israel previously had been dominated by its European Jewish or Ashkenazi population, a voting demographic traditionally associated with the Likud's long-term rival for government, the Labour Party. But when Menachem Begin, founder of the Likud, began to make strides to improve the living situation of the Mizrahi population in the 1970s, it kicked off a long-standing political allegiance which would continue for decades afterwards. The non-Ashkenazi population of Israel came, over generations, to constitute an important voter base for the Likud. For many, the withdrawal from Gaza, especially in the wake of the many civilian deaths due to Hamas's suicide bombing campaign, was a form of capitulation towards the Arabs. The Likud, in line with Israeli public opinion in the period following the failed peace attempts of the 1990s and the Second Intifada, began to move even more assuredly towards the right. In 2005, Ariel Sharon resigned and the leadership of the Likud returned to Netanyahu, who became the leader of the opposition in Israel. Learning from the unpopular decision of the previous government, Netanyahu and his party ominously indicated that no further capitulations such as the withdrawal from Gaza would occur again. By 2009, Netanyahu reassumed the prime ministership of the country, and his second term as head of the Israeli government would be more successful, continuing in the role through 3 elections until 2021. This period would see a number of prominent actions on the domestic security front, such as in 2014, when a barrage of Hamas rocket attacks from Gaza would be met with a month-long war, resulting in thousands of Palestinian deaths and several dozen Israeli deaths. During the 2010s, the Likud also began to adopt an increasingly populist character. Having previously promoted the independence of the Israeli judiciary as the decade progressed, the party began to favor tighter control over the independence of Israel's courts, finally culminating with a judicial overhaul in January 2023. The overhaul, introduced by the Likud's Minister for Justice, Yariv Levin, included a highly controversial reasonableness clause, which eliminated the previously existing power of the Israeli Supreme Court to void a decision made by the Israeli state legislature, or Knesset, in the event that it judged that decision to be unreasonable. It also included a so-called override clause, which would have given the legislative branch the power to reverse decisions of the Supreme Court if they did so with a majority Knesset backing, which in practice they already had, although Netanyahu later backtracked and removed that clause. The overhaul took place amidst a landmark criminal case brought against Netanyahu for corruption and alleged bribery. But, well, more on that in a bit. Another notable event, which occurred during Netanyahu's second term, was the 2011 exchange of over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for Israeli hostage Gilad Shalit. Shalit was an IDF conscript who'd been abducted by Hamas 5 years earlier and kept in secluded captivity in the Gaza Strip. His welfare and the length of his captivity had made him into a cause célèbre among the Israeli public. His safe return occurred amidst much fanfare, with many commenting the commitment of Netanyahu not to leave any Israeli soldiers behind, as well as the noteworthiness of the agreement reached between the warring factions. However, the exchange did lead to criticism in the Israeli cabinet, with some noting the severity of the crimes for which some of the liberated Palestinian prisoners have been convicted. Among the released were Aziz Sahar, the man whose blood-stained hands from the Ramallah window had become a notorious feature of the Second Intifada, as well as Yahya Sinwar, a senior Hamas militant sentenced to 4 life terms for terrorism, who would later go on to become the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip and played a key role in orchestrating the October 7th attacks. As Israeli public opinion continued to move towards the right, the Labour Party and others from the Israeli left and centre lost more ground, ultimately going on to suffer a crushing electoral defeat by the time of the 2022 elections. Netanyahu and the Likud drifted further to the right and started openly flirting with emergent far-right elements of Israel's political sphere, which were seeing more and more support in the late 2010s. Despite the increasing domination of his party and his successive re-elections as prime minister by the late 2010s, Netanyahu was beginning to receive spotlight for some rather nefarious business dealings. It was around the time that he was setting his sights on an unprecedented fifth election as prime minister in 2019 that Netanyahu was accused of having received lavish gifts, including cigars and champagne, from an Israeli businessman in exchange for corporate privileges. He also faced accusations of alleged interference with press freedom by exerting pressure on media executives during the early 2010s while head of government. Consequently, Netanyahu was indicted on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. In 2020, he was set to begin trial, with the State of Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu being slated for assessment by the Israeli Supreme Court. However, the trial was offset by the COVID pandemic and also faced other irregularities such as loudmouth protests by the far right and Netanyahu's loudmouth son, Yair, who publicly insinuated that the prosecutors handling the case should be executed for treason. The trial had not yet taken place by the time the 2022 elections came around, an election which Netanyahu succeeded in winning yet again, although on this occasion it was by allying himself with some rather fickle friends. Despite the case for corruption being built against him, Netanyahu managed his return to the office of prime minister through a right-wing coalition of a total of 6 parties, including several religious conservative organizations and the Otzma Yehudit, a radical Zionist political party founded in 2012. It was the inclusion of the Otzma Yehudit which raised the most eyebrows. The party had its origins in the Kach movement, the Jewish fundamentalist organization to which Baruch Goldstein, perpetrator of the Cave of the Patriarchs massacre, belonged, and was also thought to have heavily influenced Yigal Amir, the killer of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The party, like the Likud, saw its power base lie mostly among Israel's Mizrahi Jews and the massive ultra-Orthodox community, one of the fastest-growing populations in the entire world, and which saw the leftist and secular parties of Israel as generally ignorant towards their religious beliefs. With the backing of the coalition, Netanyahu was able to decisively overcome a challenge from the center and left and enter an unprecedented 6th term as prime minister in December 2022. He swiftly turned his attention to the judicial system, which sought to prosecute him, targeting it with the aforementioned overhaul package in a thinly veiled attempt to stifle the case against him. Otherwise, his term began in much the same guise as previously, with the controversial expansion of grants for Israeli settlements in the West Bank and the rapid construction of new housing units there. However, all of this would become second priority on October 7, 2023, less than a year after the election, with the vicious Hamas attack on southern Israel. And while we won't focus on the details of the brutal conflict currently being waged between Israel and Hamas in this video, chiefly because we've done so in many of our other videos, and we encourage you to check those out, it is important to mention that aside from the brutality which Israel, through its sustained bombing campaign on Gaza, was accused, Netanyahu also became subject to other criticism related to his handling of the war. Perhaps spurred by his ultra-conservative colleagues, Netanyahu has consistently ruled out concessions to the Palestinians, something applauded by some of his followers, but heavily criticized by many global onlookers, as well as the families of captive Israelis. On another front, despite his family history and his own noteworthy military service, Netanyahu received negative press attention due to the privilege seemingly enjoyed by his son, who was revealed by the Times of Israel to be residing in a luxury condominium in Florida during the early course of the war, in spite of the mandatory conscription imposed on service-age citizens of Israel. While Netanyahu has received cynical accusations of deliberately prolonging the war in order to shore up his power, what is likely is that his tenure will not long outlive the end of the war, regardless of the result. Netanyahu is now 74, and having achieved 6 terms as prime minister, common sense would suggest that this would be the twilight of his tenure as the head of the State of Israel. This is without mentioning the lingering likelihood of his prosecution for bribery, something which has not gone away and will remain a background threat unless his government successfully manages to suppress the judiciary entirely. However, doing so could also come at the cost of support from Israel's most important ally, the US, with which it already has seen a more brittle relationship due to the massive casualty count among Palestinians resulting from the war with Hamas. However, the stage may also be set for Netanyahu to try to accomplish something which would secure his legacy in Israel. That is, wiping out Hamas once and for all, the organization which carried out the worst terrorist attack in the state's history and other suicide bombing campaigns in the 90s and 2000s, which left many dead Israeli citizens. If Netanyahu could defeat and destroy Hamas, this may lend itself to a public favor which would likely far outweigh any other feat accomplished during his 6 terms and possibly obscure the ingloriousness of a potential conviction for corruption should he be found guilty. Aside from this, if Netanyahu can succeed in a post-war peace arrangement favorable to Israel, there may still be time for him to try and achieve other goals which would ingratiate him with the public and even some international partners. An example would be to at least restart the process of normalization with Arab states, something which had seen success in the late 2010s when the US brokered Abraham Accords led to expanded relations between Israel and Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, and the UAE. A key target in this regard would be Saudi Arabia, the leading spiritual and geopolitical power in the Arab world, and with which Israel was thought to be close to signing an agreement before the start of the war in late 2023. But with so much now invested in the conflict, and with an aggressive cabinet lurking behind him, the stakes for Netanyahu in the Israel-Hamas war remain incredibly high. With the next legislative election in 2026, time will tell if the long-standing leader of Israel will succeed in cementing or restoring a legacy for himself in Israel and abroad, or if the horrendous violence of the past few months will remain the leading memory of his time in office. Moreover, there is much else that remains hanging in the balance. After all, the question must be asked: who would actually replace Netanyahu? With Israel's left in a place of uncertainty, especially in the context of the current war, there is a chance that the figure who would replace Netanyahu would be even more hardline than him, such as someone from the currently dominant coalition. This could be a figure from the Likud, which remains the single largest party in the Knesset, although with Netanyahu having led the party for so long, it's difficult to say who his protege would be. But what if the next leader would be somebody from the religious conservatives, or even the Otzma Yehudit? All in all, this is something which could prove to be catastrophic for any tentative chance of future coexistence with the Palestinians.